We are very grateful for this act of creativity that you've put into the world.
Well, I am so grateful for you having me here today, and Sally for taking the time to think about and formulate and ask such deep and thoughtful questions. Not every interview is like that, and I know how much work and heart goes into that. So I really want to thank you for that.
And if there was ever a time we needed Susan Cain's latest book, the time is now. So let me set up a little backstory on Susan before we yield the floor to her. Susan started what has been named the Quiet Movement with her book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, which revolutionized how the world sees introverts and how introverts see themselves. Over the years, that book has had an enormous impact on the workplace, specifically in reimagining introverts as equally valuable, though often differently skilled from their extroverted peers. Her latest book, Bittersweet, How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole, works in a similar way by distinguishing and elevating those of us who have a bittersweet outlook on life, those who carry the light and the dark with them, when the predominant message of our culture trumpets the power of positivity. I'm sure there are many of you in attendance who are already nodding your heads, recognizing yourselves, and it won't be the only time as we talk with Susan. And if you have any questions for Susan that we can bring into the conversation toward the end of the hour, please go ahead and share those in chat. And Susan, I'm very honored to be talking with you this morning. On the top shelf of my bookcase here at work, I have featured some of the books that have influenced me most as a manager and really as a human. And your book, Quiet, stands side by side with Brené Brown's Rising Strong. Two books that have changed the way that I bring my whole self to work and present myself in life. As an aspirational introvert, Quiet was really important to me. And Bittersweet spoke to me the entire time that I was reading it and listening to the audiobook and listening to your voice tell me this story that you so beautifully have written. So let's spend a little time with your beautifully written and enlightening book, Bittersweet. Thank you for being here. Thank you for writing this book.
Well, Sally, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. And I'm honored to be up there on your shelf alongside my dear friend, Brené. And so great to be here with you. And also, I want to say a big thanks to Daniel for his introduction. And I'm excited to get started.
I'm trying to fix I have you in a little corner here, but it's going to work. Technology. We've already discussed the challenges, right? I think that I have so many things that I would like to talk to you about this book, that this could be a multi-hour conversation. And I know you have a very busy schedule, as do our attendees. So let's dive right in and start where you started. And that is with how the mournful music of Leonard Cohen started you on a decades-long quest to answer one rather simple question: why did you enjoy listening to melancholy music? And ended with you writing this book about something far less simple, of sorrow and longing and our human experience.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the book, I tell the story of how, before I became a writer, I was a lawyer, which was like a whole kind of crazy detour in my life. But I tell the story in the book about how when I was in law school, in my law school dorm first year, some friends were kind of swinging by my dorm room to pick me up for class. And they arrived in my dorm room to find me listening to, or I should say blasting from my stereo speakers, sad music. It was probably Leonard Cohen. I don't know who it was, but
right.
Someone like that. And my friends were like they thought it was really funny that I was listening to that music. And one of them asked me why I was listening to funeral music. And at the time I just laughed, like the way he said it was really funny. And I laughed and we went to class, and that was the end of it, except that it ignited in me this question of what it was about that music that I loved so much, and what it was about our culture that made it vaguely embarrassing to be listening to it, except in very like narrowly circumscribed moments. And, there's sort of an idea that you should be listening kind of in private at specific times of the day. So what was that? And why was it that music like that made me feel not sad at all, actually, but instead feel kind of uplifted and connected to humanity? And I would feel like kind of awash in gratitude to the musician and in love for all the humanity that had known the sorrow that the music was trying to express. I felt all these things. I just wanted to know the answer to that question. But in trying to answer that question, and we could talk about what sad music really is, but in trying to answer that question, I realized that there is this centuries old tradition in all our religions, in our literary tradition, our art, our music, of artists, of theologians, now of psychologists, all trying to tell us that this bittersweet experience that all humans have to know, because life is, for all of us, some sort of mix of joy and sorrow, that this bittersweetness is one of the most direct routes we have to creativity and connection and transcendence. And this bittersweet tradition that we all have access to, we've all inherited it. It's glorious. And our culture doesn't talk about it because, we're so meant to only focus on what's supposedly positive that we're actually overlooking this other incredibly deeply positive tradition. It's just positive in a very different way.
There are so many avenues to go down. We could start talking about our winners and losers culture. We can start talking about how longing breaks us open. I've got so many things. So I think what that represents is the fact that I found this book to be such a richly textured and layered reading experience. The scope of your resources and references is so vast. You include academic research, case studies, spiritual philosophers and religious leaders, management theorists and business leaders, poetry, music, as well as weaving in elements of memoir and creative nonfiction, as it were. The substantive, can't talk, content makes bittersweet, which one might think of as being sort of an elusive or ephemeral concept, very tangible. And so I'm wondering how, since that first question when you were in college, which I think could be also asked, why am I the way I am?
Yeah. How
did that develop into this book that is just so wide ranging and yet redefines a word, bittersweet, that we may not be accustomed to thinking as our own?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the challenge of writing this book was kind of embedded in the question you just asked, which is it felt this concept of bittersweetness felt to me like simultaneously the most real thing in the world and also the most ineffable. And if something is ineffable by definition, it's therefore hard to render it in words. And so, but I guess I did what I had done with Quiet, which is like my process seems to be that I get consumed by a question or like something that I'm, burning to express. And then I just sort of walk around the world for a few years, looking at everything through that question. So, everything I read for years, every conversation I had, I took all these different trips. Like I immersed myself in different religious traditions, in like the psychology of bereavement. I went back to my college to interview students about what they were really feeling underneath the shiny surfaces that they all presented. I went to talk to Pete Docter, the director at Pixar, who had produced the amazing movie Inside Out, which actually made sadness, like an embodied version of sadness, the central character of the movie. So I guess I did my usual process of just kind of looking at everything through this lens. And then I realized how how many embodiments there actually were of this supposedly ineffable concept of bittersweetness. But the real challenge was like, how the heck do you weave all of that into a coherent narrative? And that took me some years to figure out.
It is, I think, the image of it being weaved together is such an apt one. It really is. In my reading of the book and trying to, I would follow one thread and realize that you had brought it all the way back from the beginning and through to the end. And yet there were so many different layers to take it. It's a phenomenal experience reading the book. And I hope that everyone here gets a chance to read it. And I think that one of the things that brings our participants here today, and as well as other readers to the book, is a feeling of resonance with the word bittersweet. But can you walk us through a little bit what defines the bittersweet temperament, how I sort of reimagine what that is and how that can inform how we live our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in a second, as you know, I developed together with two friends of mine who are great psychologists, Scott Barry Kaufman and David Yaden. Together, we developed this bittersweet quiz that people can take to assess where they feel they fall on, or to assess how prone they are to states of bittersweetness. So in a second, I'll walk people through a few questions from that quiz to give you all listening a sense of it. But first, just to define kind of what I mean by bittersweetness, it is, as you were just saying, it's kind of like an intense awareness of the fact that life involves a kind of pairing of light and dark and joy and sorrow and bitter and sweet. And that life is inherently impermanent. So that everything that we love most deeply will not be here forever. But that what comes along with that realization is this kind of intensely piercing joy at the beauty of everything. Like C.S. Lewis called joy stabs of longing. And so that's the kind of emotion it is. But to now sort of bring it down into, let's say, everyday terms, some of the questions from the quiz are things like, do you react intensely to art, music, or nature? Do you draw comfort or inspiration from a rainy day? Do you have others called you an old soul? Do you find yourself getting goosebumps several times a day? And in general, the more you answer yes to these kinds of questions, the more prone you are to this state of bittersweetness. And then what's really interesting beyond that, we looked to figure out, for people who are prone to bittersweetness, what are their other characteristics? And what we found is that people who are high in this bittersweet state, meaning they're prone to this state of mind, they also tend to be high in, the trait that the psychologist Elaine Aron calls high sensitivity, which means kind of like a sensitivity to everything, the good and the bad, whatever is happening to you, you're reacting that much more intensely to it than your typical person. Also, what comes along with bittersweetness is a tendency to states of awe and wonder and spirituality and transcendence. And then also a tendency to a state called absorption, which predicts creativity. And this was really interesting because I did this whole chapter in the book, as you know, about the connections between bittersweetness and creativity. Yeah. And I wrote that whole chapter before we had the results of this quiz. So it was like all the research was pointing to this connection between bittersweetness and creativity, but I had no idea whether the data that we were gathering was going to back that up. And in fact, it did in the end.
As I read the book, I felt like, as we do when we connect deeply with a book and where we feel a sense of kindred spirits or an enlightenment of sorts into ourselves, see ourselves reflected back to us. And I know that I felt very much like this was a book that I wish that I could go back in time and give to my 10-year-old self give to my 20-year-old self, my 30-year-old self. I feel now that I am where I am at my age, that I have learned a little bit of something that you write way to the end of the book about how do you hold melancholy in your hand, or how do you hold melancholy in your life? And I think that for most of my life, I didn't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. I thought I wasn't supposed to. I thought that I was supposed to push it away and give it away. Even as I took some amount of pride in my sensitivity, or, people connected to me because I could visit them on that level when they wanted to visit the melancholy or the bittersweet. And I think that what this book does for people is much, as I've said in the introduction, does what quiet did for people who also didn't trust themselves as introverts, mm-hmm. and to learn a trust in themselves as someone who has this bittersweet temperament, and that it isn't something that, in contrast to our culture that is very positive focused, that those of us who experience aren't less than, and can adapt and create strategies and skills for implementing how we live it in our lives. And how did you feel that through all of this research that you changed the way that you commune with your own bittersweetness?
I don't know if I've changed the way I commune with it, because for whatever reason, I think I've always had a deep feeling that whatever powers I happen to have, and I have the feeling that all humans are born with their own particular powers, and that mm-hmm. the ones that I happen to have been granted, I somehow felt that they were connected to whatever that thing was in me that I'm now calling bittersweetness. So I don't know that it's changed for me, but what I can say is the most amazing thing about writing a book like this. And I had the same exact experience with Quiet. You write something like this, and by definition, if you're writing about something that people aren't talking about much, or don't talk about in a positive light, you don't really know how many other people out there are experiencing the same thing. It's almost mm-hmm. like a feeling of, writing a message in a bottle and sending it out into the waves, and hoping that other people will find the bottle and read the message. So like when I first started writing Quiet, truly, I thought I was working on this weird and idiosyncratic project that was a little embarrassing to talk about. And then you discover, oh my gosh, half the population feels this way. So the same thing is happening now with Bittersweet, like where I'm getting these letters from people who are like, oh my gosh, this is this thing I've been feeling all my life. And I cannot tell you how intensely, deeply gratifying it is to hear from people saying this, and to hear other people putting in their own words this thing that I've been trying to express for my whole life. Like what I got this incredible letter from a guy, he's a filmmaker in LA, and he talked about how he'd grown up in New York City, and all his life he would I guess as a teenager, he would be walking along the city streets at night, coming back from a party or an event, and he would listen to that same kind of music that I was listening to that day in my dorm. And he said the feeling would come over him, and he didn't know how to describe it. He always called it, quote, that holy feeling.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And he too, as you were suggesting in your question, had gotten the sense that there was something dangerous or shameful in feelings connected to melancholy. So he had been mm-hmm. trying to push it down, even though there was something in him that knew that it was a source of depth and power. Mm-hmm. So yeah, to connect with people, naming that experience to me is just the most intense joy. And then also one of my great wishes from this book is to reach out to the world of mainstream psychology, which right now does not have a language for distinguishing between melancholy and depression,
Right.
even though these really are completely different states. Like clinical depression is awful. There's no creativity that comes from it. It's misery, it's emotional numbness, it's an emotional black hole. That's very different from this state of being connected to the joys and sorrows of the world. And yet, if you roam around in psychology databases the way that I do, and you put melancholy into your search terms, all you get is articles about clinical depression. So it's like this whole realm of human experience not being adequately studied or talked about.
There are a few things in what you just said that I'm going to go all over the map here, but when you were talking at the beginning, when you were talking about that you believe that we are all born with powers, and that reminded me of, I noted the quote, the section in here, you're referencing Tim Chang, who is a venture capitalist, and you quoted him saying, this is a quote from you, greatness, he told me, often comes from developing a superpower that adapts to the blow that almost killed you. And I get chills just reading that. And then you also write, remember the linguistic origins of the word yearning. The place you suffer is the place you care. Therefore, the best response to pain is to dive deeper into your caring. And so two things I think here. What can we learn from harnessing our trauma or accessing our superpower through that thing? And here, I'll leave it at that, and then I'll ask my next question after.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a kind of a discipline in psychology called acceptance and commitment therapy. It was that term was coined, and this field was invented by a guy named Stephen Hayes. And the basic idea is when something difficult happens to you, or when you're grappling with negative emotions, difficult experiences, number one, to accept it, not to try to like push it away, but to accept what you're feeling and grant that it's okay to be feeling the way that you are. But that's the acceptance part. But the commitment part of acceptance and commitment therapy is to realize that if you're feeling that much pain, it's because something has happened in a realm of your life where you care especially deeply. Excuse me. So like if you're really upset about a lost love, it's telling you that love really matters to you, or, that the kind of relationship that you've just lost really matters to you. And then you ask yourself, well, what can I do with this realm that matters so much to me? And how can I dive into that realm that matter? Like, how can I commit myself to that particular realm? And so in the book, I tell a lot of stories of different people who have done exactly that. And one kind of archetypal line that we have in our heritage is the idea of the wounded healer, which dates all the way back to Greek mythology, where we had figures who'd been wounded like physically in these tales, and then as a result of those wounds were granted the power to heal others who suffered from the same or similar wounds. And you see people doing this all the time, right? It's like, a woman loses a beloved child to a drunk driver and then starts an organization called Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Or the collective response that we have, like after 9/11, there was suddenly a surge of applications of people to become firefighters, or even to sign up for Teach of America. Like the applications shot up in the wake of that event. So there's something about like we sustain some kind of wound, and there's just a natural response to seek meaning and to try to cure future wounds of the same kind. And that's a very, not just empowering, it's a very elevating response to the pains that we have to endure. And it's not to say I don't want in any way to like minimize the force of those pains, or to say that all pains can be healed exactly, but just to turn ourselves in the direction of trying to transform pain into beauty. Also, I want to say it's also not to say that the mandate is that anybody who suffered a pain of some kind should now like go create a worldwide organization. Right. Like it doesn't have to be on such a grand scale. It can be in very small and daily acts that we take.
Even if it's self-care for ourselves, I think. And in one of my notes, I wrote that reading this book was a self-care act that I didn't know I needed. Mm. And it feels a bit that writing it may have been a self-care act that you needed. You share your own personal stories among the stories of all of the other folks that you feature in the book, and your relationship with your mother, your relationship with yourself. And I think that brings in a sense of not only, this sounds a bit clinical, but application for us, but also that this was a deeply personal experience. And I think early on, you tell a story about when you were in a writing class and you were trying to write about your relationship with your mother. And I think you wrote a fiction piece, and your instructor told you to put it away for 30 years. Yeah. And so now here we are 30 years later, and you have this piece that includes that story, and that feels like, do you feel like that's a full circle, like that this is the book that you were meant to write?
Yeah, very much so. And I guess I won't go into the whole story of what happened with my mother here, though, as you say, I tell it in the book. But one aspect of the story is that, we had a very wonderful and then difficult and then relationship that ended in a kind of redemptive moment in time, you could say. But for decades, because of this difficulty, for decades, I could not speak about my mother without crying. Like I couldn't, as I write in the book, I couldn't say a simple thing, like answer a question like, where'd your mother grow up? She grew up in Brooklyn. I couldn't say something as straightforward as that without crying. And I was actually worried about, and I knew I was writing the story in this book. And so I was worried about what was going to happen when I went out on the book tour. And I thought, well, what if people ask me about that story, and I'm on air with lots of people listening, and what if I just like lose it? Right. And even though I'm not averse to people crying in public, I didn't really want to be, so at the mercy of emotions that I just couldn't control at all, like that. And anyway, really the most miraculous thing happened, which is that, as you intuit, just through the act of writing this book, all of that became settled for me, and that's no longer an issue. And I guess I had heard before about the idea that writing can be this grand act of catharsis, but I guess I would have thought of that as like one of those pat things that people say that can't possibly be really, really true. But it was really, really true. Like, yeah. There is, and that's one of the great paradoxes. There is something about being willing to go to the place where joy and sorrow meet that is actually healing, as opposed to what our culture tells us, which is that, it would drag you down to be looking at sorrow in the face, that it would be like a Medusa that would turn you to stone, but that's not actually how it works.
I think that's very true. I just want to add, there is a principle that you share in the book that speaks to what you just explained about sort of the writing as catharsis, or you say, whatever pain you can't get rid of, make it your creative offering. And I think that is, as readers, that's what we will experience through reading Bittersweet and following that path that you took as well. And I think that can do that for those of us who will then read it. Because I think you also then say, or find someone that can do it for you, I think is the rest of that phrase. So I want to talk for a second about.
Wait, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Absolutely.
Because yes, I do say that and really mean it. But I just want to kind of like hasten to add, that doesn't mean that you have to go and write a whole book because that that takes years. So there are much simpler ways to do it, and for some people it's like cooking dinner for their family or as you said, find someone to do it for you. There's all this amazing research that shows that it's not only the act of creating art, but just the act of immersing yourself in it or engaging with art as the so-called consumer of it. That in and of itself is incredibly healing. So it's more like a matter of just immersing yourself in whatever realm of creativity speaks to you personally. And again, it can be small. And one of the things that I did as I was writing this book is I started following all these art accounts on Twitter and until my feed was full of art. And then when that happened, and I did this because I had fallen into this black hole of doom scrolling Twitter every morning during the pandemic. And that was no good. So, but once I had this feed full of art, I started curating. So every day I would begin my writing morning by picking a favorite piece of art and then pairing it with a poem or a quotation that I thought went well with it and putting that up on my social channels. And then all these other people who loved that came and so it felt like this community of people who were all bonded around this beauty. And you could say that was a kind of inefficient way to start my writing day because it took like an hour every morning to do this, but it really put me into such a generative and peaceful frame of mind. And I think that that's what immersing in a realm of creativity can do for us.
There are a couple of, I want to talk about the word longing.
Yeah.
And on the subtitle of the book is How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole. And you elucidate longing for us in a way that I think is really important, an important distinction to make for people. I can imagine that even though those of us in attendance today and those of us drawn to your book are already there, we're already embracing our bittersweet. But I think that there are also people who are more comfortable with the culture of pushing that away, getting over your grief, not wallowing in what is presumed as negative thoughts, that there's a distinction to be made about longing being a passive, indulgent act, and that it is actually, maybe that's not, act is not even a right word to say there, but that longing is actually an active force that drives us to whatever aspiration it is that we have, that it is the thing that keeps us moving toward the vision of, or the pursuit of that which we don't have and that which we long for.
Yeah.
And that's really critical for people to be open, have an open cup when they come to this idea of bittersweet and how the longing can work in a person.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And we all know this. We all know the state of longing instinctively, even though we don't label it that. But, those moments that you have when you're at a concert and you're suddenly moved beyond what you could express, or, you're watching an Olympian or an incredible tennis player or whoever, and you're like, how the heck do they do that? And it's like, it feels as if at that moment they have descended to this earth from, some higher, better place. And they're expressing for us everything that we're yearning for. And this idea of longing, and as you say, you're right, like in our culture, longing is associated with like you're mired in longing. And it's something that would keep you stuck in the ground like a kind of emotional quicksand. But historically, that is not how it's been understood. Like the very etymology of the word longing literally means to grow longer, like to reach for. So it's reaching for that which you would want to attain. All of our religions tell us this, like we're longing for the Garden of Eden. We're longing for Mecca. We're longing for Zion. My favorite version of it, the poet Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, who's the 12th century Sufi poet, Sufism is basically the mystical version of Islam. And the whole heart of Sufism and of most mystical traditions is the idea that you long for the divine, and the very act of longing for the divine is the act that's going to bring you that much closer. So the longing is the union itself. The longing is how you get to the union. It's a kind of internal paradox that we've completely lost touch with. But I think for what we're longing, when we experience that kind of spiritual longing, and I'm using these spiritual terms, but I mean this to apply to atheists and believers alike. Right. It's basically talking about the inner human longing for everything that is love, that is true, that is beautiful, that is perfection, all of which will remain eternally elusive. And yet the act of longing for it is what brings us closer and what brings us to our most creative selves.
Let's take that one step further with another quote from the book where you write that, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, that the secret our poets and philosophers have been trying to tell us all along is that longing is the great gateway to belonging. Can you walk us through that and how that happens?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll tell you first about, like, I'll give you some examples of how we're all actually immersed in this message and don't even realize it. And then I'll tell you like a story from my own life. The ways in which we don't even realize it, look at all our children's literature, like Harry Potter, or Pippi Longstocking. Why is it that so many of these protagonists are orphans? And we just kind of accept that as like the catalyst that gets the story going. But it's like basically what these writers have been telling us for such a long time is that there's something about this act or this condition of brokenness and yearning for a reunion, in this case with the parents. That is what gets the epic adventure in motion. Same thing with Homer's Odyssey. Like, we think of it as a story of epic adventure, which it is, but it begins with Odysseus, who is weeping with homesickness for his native land of Ithaca. Like, the poem starts with him weeping on a beach, longing for home. That has always been the great human catalyst. Like, we come into this world longing for home. We come into this world in tears. And whether you interpret that psychoanalytically as longing for the womb that we've just had to exit, or you interpret it in theological terms, kind of doesn't matter. That's our psyche. So in my own life, like, one way that this played out is that I spent all those years as a corporate lawyer. And it's a whole story of how I left corporate law, but basically, like, in one fell swoop, when I was in my early 30s, I left my career, left a 7-year relationship that had always felt wrong, left the apartment in which I had been living. And so I was suddenly in this state of free fall with like no career, no relationship, no place to live. And I immediately fell into a relationship with a guy. I'd wanted to be a writer. I should say first, I had wanted to be a writer my whole life, but had been off on this great detour of being a lawyer. And I suddenly fell into a relationship with this guy who was a lyricist and a musician. And it became one of these obsessive relationships that I just could not extricate myself from. I couldn't do it. And I would regale a friend of mine, a friend Naomi, with, like incessant tales of this guy I was obsessed with. And she listened patiently to me day after day until one day she said to me, if you're this obsessed, it's because he represents something you're longing for. So what are you longing for? And just the act of her asking that question, I instantly understood that this obsession, this guy represented to me the world of art and writing that I had always wanted to be a part of my whole life, and had been on this big detour. And he was a kind of like emissary from that more perfect world, what felt to me like that more perfect world. And immediately with that realization, the obsession completely melted away. I never had it again. And I started writing for real. And I think that's a question that we should all ask ourselves. If you're longing for a specific piece of real estate or whatever it is in your life, what does it actually represent to you? And what direction is it pointing to you to go in? That's really the question.
I have a note here that says that I want to stress to all readers of the book that they must read through to the coda, because I think that the questions that you pose to us following this story that you tell at the end there is our first step to engage in that recognition of home and how, and whatever that is in terms of a literal or figurative sense for us, that those questions can bring us closer to that feeling of home, that which we seek and long for. Mm-hmm. I want to quickly, because I know quiet was very influential for a lot of people in the workplace, I want to visit sort of the greater, span out from the personal here for a moment and talk a little bit about both the greater cultural and also our work culture, and how recognizing the bittersweet plays a role in what we bring to work, and what kind of workplaces people are welcome in, but also then how our greater culture deems that to be maybe soft skills or something that is less ambitious and less accomplished than what we deem valuable.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot in there. That's a big question.
No, I totally get it. And I guess what I'd say, excuse me, the bad news is that our work culture still has, still has a long way to go in terms of allowing us to bring our full emotional landscape to the world of work. You could say that sorrow is the last great taboo in the workplace. Mm-hmm. It's the one thing you're really not supposed to talk about. You can talk about it again in very limited and narrow lanes. Like if you've just, if you've had a death in the immediate family, you're allowed to feel sad for a certain amount of time publicly at work. But there's this whole constellation of griefs that the psychologist Kenneth Doka calls disenfranchised griefs. Mm-hmm. The ones that are less socially acceptable to talk about, that are still really off limits. And in fact, there's this one really incredible project done by a psychologist named, or two, Jason Canoff and Laura Madden. And they conducted all these interviews with people at work and just asked them about their experiences. And they found that people would they would give them accounts of all these like terrible and upsetting things that had happened to them at their workplaces. Mm-hmm. But when asked to label the emotions that they felt about those experiences, they may have been anxious, but they would describe themselves as feeling angry, or like they were really sad and upset, and they would describe themselves as feeling frustrated. Mm-hmm. So there's this automatic editing that we do of our own emotional landscape, where we like tamp down anything that speaks of loss and sorrow, because it's just not allowed. Okay, so that's the bad news. The good news is that things are starting to change slowly but surely. It was actually Jason Canoff who pointed this out to me, that ever since, I think he said it was around 9/11 was when this changed. Harvard Business Review started to run more and more articles about the virtues of compassionate leadership, and like focusing on compassion in the workplace. And increasingly, it is being understood that that plays a role. And what does compassion have to do with all this? Well, the very word compassion means like with suffering, with sorrow, so it means like engaging with other people's expressions of distress. And there are case studies that have been done that have shown the virtues of having a culture of compassion in a workplace, and how it's actually really good for the bottom line as well as for people's souls. So I would say things are changing slowly but surely, but we, as with all things, it takes a while.
I have what I think is so what connects many of the points that you're making is that we don't have to live with dichotomies, and that even in looking at bitter and sweet, that it is bittersweet. It is both things. And there is a section, I was just looking for my note and I'm not going to be able to find it, but let's see if I can recreate it, that there's a section in when you're talking about business in the workplace and compassion in the workplace as being the solution, that it is because of all of the things that we value. And one of them is innovation, that with innovation holds hands with failure. And there's a list, there are a number of these things that we value that hold hands with something that we are less comfortable with as a result. And we have to make a peace with the fact that these aspirational qualities also come with some element of sorrow or sadness or disappointment. Yeah. And that's, I think, I'm going to put that note next to my desk.
Yeah, it's right. And it's like, I mean, would we wish that the world weren't that way? Probably most of us would. And if we could wave a magic wand and wave away our sorrows, we would probably do it. And wave away other people's sorrows, we would probably do it. But the idea is that that's not the world we have. And that in the world that we have, there are better and worse ways to engage with the fact that sorrow is part of life. And to understand that it does happen to be a wellspring of creativity. And it also happens to be a wellspring of connection, of human connection. And we know this, like the psychologist Dr. Keltner did these amazing studies where he was studying what he called the compassionate instinct. And he found, for example, that we all have a vagus nerve, which is the biggest bundle of nerves in our bodies. And this is a very fundamental part of us evolutionarily. Like all mammals have a vagus nerve. It regulates our breathing and our digestion. So it's been part of us through the whole evolutionary process. Well, our vagus nerve also becomes activated when we see someone else experiencing distress. And that's kind of an amazing finding, because it's showing that the same part of our bodies that helps us breathe also reacts when we see other people in sorrow. And so it's a bonding mechanism. And like this one study of an organization called Midwest Billings. Right. Midwest Billings was a company where their job, the whole thing that they do, is collect unpaid bills from people who have been in the hospital. So no one likes this job. It's not a fun job. The turnover in this industry is sky high because no one wants to do it. But at Midwest Billings, they had created this culture where it was just part of what people did to help each other out when they were having trouble. whether the trouble was domestic violence or the common cold, like people would rally to support each other. And as a result, they had a turnover of only 2%, and they got their bills collected, like I think it was something like twice as fast as their competitors in the industry, because there's something about working in that kind of environment that really lifts people up. So that's what I mean when I say, if we could wish sorrow away, we would, but given that sorrow is here,
right,
it's also a pathway to connection.
So we are nearing the end of our time, and which I cannot help myself but to use this as a segue into the last question that I want to get to. I don't see any questions in our chat, so I'm going to go ahead and plow into this one, which is a good portion of your book, and particularly the third section, is about impermanence and mortality. Mm-hmm. And it is about the fact that we carry with us from the day of our birth an assurance of death. Mm-hmm. And it's a wide-ranging section that I was really intrigued by your experience investigating the immortalists, I think, or immortalism, and people who are rallying around the idea of that if we knew we would never die, we would actually be better people, because that fear of death and perhaps that clinging to your piece of the pie and all of your concerns would sort of go away, and we would become more altruistic. But you counter that with actually, it is the knowledge of our death, and it is the acceptance of impermanence as being that which makes us human, but also opens us up to feeling a need to make the most of the time that we have. And I'm wondering if you can share with us how that investigation into death is not something that we should shy away from in this book, or in fact, talking with one another about it as a culture can really help us in alleviating a lot of the stress and conflict that we have.
Yeah. Oh my God. So this is such a big topic to talk about in just a few minutes. But,
no pressure at all.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of where to start. It's very complicated. The people who I call the immortalists, there are many words, longevity advocates or whatever it is. I find them incredibly fascinating. And in the book, I describe having attended one of their conferences. And these are basically scientists and other people who are working to extend our human health spans and lifespans as long as we possibly can, to the point ultimately of immortality. And it's a really interesting question, putting aside the question of if and when we could ever really get there. Mm-hmm. The question of, do we want this or not?
Right.
And one of them put to me this incredible thought experiment of like, okay, well, yeah. And the thought experiment is meant for people who are skeptical about their project. And the experiment goes like, okay, ask yourself, do you want to die tomorrow? Well, probably not. Would you want to die the day after tomorrow, or the day after that, or the day after that? Like if given the choice. And it turns out it's really very hard to say that there's ever a day that you would want to push that button, which suggests that we all might like to be immortal, or to extend it out forever, or extend it out as to some kind of asymptote of forever. And what does that tell us? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I guess what I end up thinking is, number one, that's not the world we have right now. And in the world that we have right now, where mortality is a real thing, this knowledge of our fragility does turn out to be one of our pathways to wisdom. And there have been really fascinating studies showing that the more people know that their days are numbered and are really like aware in a visceral way of that fragility, that the more they live their lives with meaning and invest in their deep relationships and feel a deeper sense of gratitude and awe, and like these states that most of us would want to inhabit all the time seem to be more readily available when we're acutely aware of life's fragility. And so I think there's a way to hold all these truths at the same time. Like the Stoic philosophers thousands of years ago were teaching us to practice what they called memento mori, which meant to always remember death. And we hear that in contemporary culture and think that's morbid, but it's exactly the opposite. It's like the more you realize we may not be here tomorrow, we have no idea. The more you realize that, the more you're living life with like this intense awareness of its preciousness and beauty. And like, every time, for me, I was encountering these ideas during a time when my sons were pretty little still, and I was putting them to bed every night. And instead of, and the more I had these ideas in mind, the less I wanted to check my phone during those bedtimes. And the more I was like, oh my gosh, this is like insanely great. And I'm just going to be in this moment. And why would I distract myself with this? So those are just some ideas, but there's so much more to say, but those are some ideas about how to think about mortality.
And I think as much as I can't add to that beautiful and meaningful sentiment. I think that what that does show us is that living our most full and sensitive and aware and engaged life comes from when we connect the bitter and the sweet, because one reflects the other. And that is ultimately our most clear vision, when we can see all that being human actually is. And that is what the gift of your book teaches us.
It's just lovely to be here with you.
It is my pleasure.